keep coming sort of further around so they can get closer as well. And the next thing is, if you could move forward again so there is a gap behind you for passers-by to come through. It will disturb us repeatedly otherwise. Excellent, thank you. Well, here we are at the east end of York Minster, and as you can see, it's nearly finished. However, I actually wanted to draw your attention to that pale stone house on the end. You see the black and white window frames and the signposts on the front. In particular, though, could you have a look at the small rectangular window on the right-hand side of the building, just next to that vertical drain pipe there? Most of you got that fairly imprinted in your mind's eye? On your memory card, as the case may be.
Well,
good. You can turn around this way again. What polite. Now, the address of the house over there is number 5 College Street, and that's an address which is very famous among circles of people who are interested in ghosts, phantoms, apparitions, and other such things. Because, well, if any house is haunted, then that one there is most certainly one of them. We always come and stand a bit further away, just out of respect for the people who live over there today. The people in here we hate. Not only are they teachers, but they've painted the walls this ridiculous purple colour. Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen influence, I imagine. Number 5 College Street there, particularly well known because inside that house, not so very long ago, lived a family who became the subject of a series of strange happenings. Now, these began with an overwhelming atmosphere of sadness that would occasionally fill all of the rooms of the building. The frequent sound of footsteps echoing all around the place, often coming from within the very room in which the family was sitting, and the unexplained sound of crying coming from the upper part of the building. Now, so distinct was that crying in particular that the nanny of the day would often rush upstairs thinking one of the children was distressed, but on throwing open the doors to the nursery, the crying would cut off, as though somebody had turned off a radio. Indeed, on closer examination, she could see the children were all still sound asleep. Now, this all carried on for several years. The children gradually grew older, as they normally do, all things being well. And they too started to become aware of these disturbances until, in fact, one morning, one of them came up to the nanny and said, "Nanny, don't let the little girl come and sit on our bed tonight. We don't like her crying all the time." Never actually had that voice before. Thought I might try something extra. Probably won't do it tomorrow. So, the nanny was then fairly certain. Oh, thank you. The nanny was fairly certain, firstly, that this child had been inhaling helium. You've got to make the best of these things. And secondly, she was fairly certain that this child was not making things up, because she had also been aware of the figure of a small girl, aged maybe just 2 or 3 years old, wearing an old-fashioned white dress and passing unhappily around the rooms of the building. But when she discovered that the children had been talking to their ghostly visitor, and indeed even trying to play with it, she immediately took the step of removing them from the room in which they slept, which was, of course, the centre of the haunting. And that room was indeed that one there, with a little rectangular window frame, which is just the same as it was a moment ago. Just the same for 400 years. You'll be pleased to know it actually became a guest bedroom. Usually reserved for, southerners, tourists, Americans, the lower forms of life, really. But every guest who stayed in there would complain of a sleepless night. They would constantly be awoken by a hammering at the doors and windows, a sickening, pungent odour that filled their nostrils, and again, the overwhelming atmosphere of sadness. Now, after a while, this all became such a nuisance that the family took the fairly unusual step of calling in one of York's few genuine mediums, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. And that night, filled with an air of apprehension and dread, I look quite good this evening actually, apprehension and dread, they all sat down to a séance. Now, we'll probably never know the full story of what happened during this séance, because the medium swore them all to secrecy about the variety of hidden ropes and mirrors that she used that evening. But we do know a little bit about the story that was developed. It appeared that the ghost inside there belonged to a little girl who lived there during the 17th century, when the Great Plague, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, was again ravaging York. Now, the Great Plague, I'm sure you've been mostly aware, essentially it was a particularly horrible disease which was said to be carried on the backs of rats. by the black flea. And once you were infected, death was almost certain to follow, because the disease attacks the lymphatic system of the body. It causes lymph nodes in the armpits, the elbows and the groin to swell up into the great buboes, the lumps that are characteristic of the illness. This is where its name comes from. But these would erupt into great red festering sores, which would ooze a thick, vile, yellow, suppurated pus. I've always enjoyed that bit as well, man. Reminds me of my childhood for some reason. Not really sure why. After a while, though, the symptoms would progress. The patient would suffer an intense fever, shivering, vomiting, delirious. The sores would grow redder and redder, blacker and blacker, pussier and pussier. As death approached. You'll be pleased to know, should the disease reach the lungs, an even nastier death would follow. Because as the lungs slowly filled with the infected fluid, the patient would gradually suffocate, effectively drowning on their own phlegm. Sorry, I've been very well recently. Now, York had been infected by the plague on several occasions throughout the centuries, and this time they really wanted to try to control its spread a bit more effectively than they had done previously, so the decision was taken to seal off the whole area surrounding the Minster. All these streets around here were cordoned off, put into quarantine. Now, the quarantine period lasted for 10.5 months, and by order of the civic authorities, all of the infected houses were boarded up, marked with a red cross on the front. So, the little girl and the family in there also became infected. But through a 1 in a million chance, the girl miraculously recovered, only to find that she was trapped. She was boarded up inside her own house, with only the rotting corpses of her family for company. We can only imagine the anguish and the terror that young girl felt. The long, tearful night spent clinging to the stiffening fingers of her parents. Every night she would cry in vain. She would bang on the boarded up doors and windows of that house there with her tiny little fist in a desperate but completely futile attempt to attract attention. Even if anybody had heard her, nobody would have come anywhere near. She had the plague. She was too much of a danger. So finally, tired, lonely, restless and confused, she starved to death. So it's not really surprising that the ghost of that little girl would return to seek attention and comfort from later generations. And in fact, even to this day, people wandering around here have insisted that they have seen, in that window there, the tear-stained face of a little girl looking out and longing for the life that she never had.
Oh.
Actually, do you like this? My mum made it for me. Do the wash now, to be honest. I always find that story very upsetting. Nobody seemed at all emotional. You see.
I did.
Thank you, sir. So, are you all social workers or something? Well, we're going to start to carry on a bit further away from the Minster anyway. We're heading to somewhere, it's only about 3 or 4 minutes walk from here, but it is a place which is a lot smaller, a bit more intimate. It's a place, actually, whose residents could never have imagined the opulence, the splendour, the sheer scaffolding of an area like this in their entire rather shortened lives. So I'll leave you to think about that. Do try to upset each other a little on the way while we continue in that direction. Thank you.
I know. Did you notice so? No, I showed you. You should look happy. Oh. Huh? Come on.
Yeah. That feel my time? Yeah. How many scared? 9. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's right. Only Owen's left.
So is that the little girl was very like the little girl in the painting?
Yes.
Painting night.
Okay, painting dolls not from your life.
What
I'm going to have more Lindsay with it.
Okay.
He looks bored.
Yeah, so it's a proper one, which I can't remember if that's the one.